recording started?
Yeah, just now.
I welcome up the Prime Minister. Here.
I'll take POI in the chat, but if I haven't taken you by like 5:30, feel free to yell out. Two claims from opening government. The first on affordability, the second on community. Before that, just for the purpose of like painful obviousness, what does this debate actually mean? I think when you talk about a suburb, we just mean it tends to be towards the outskirts of a city, so relatively far away from the city centre, as opposed to living in something like Zone 1 of London, for example, where you're quite literally near where most of your major offices and shops are. To be clear, the fact that we're in Western Europe means it's actually incredibly easy for you to get to the city centre if you live in the suburbs. So even in London, where the tube is famously shit, you can go from Zone 4 to Zone 1 in about 50 minutes. This debate is just specifically about where you buy your home. The first claim on affordability, and what we're going to suggest here is just really obvious. The kinds of real estate that you're likely to get access to, particularly as a first-time homeowner, is going to be incredibly expensive when you're buying in the city centre. There are several reasons for this. The first and most obvious is that the areas that are in the process of being gentrified tend to see incredibly surging demand. And the reason for this is that there tends to be an actual shortage of housing supply in these cities in the first place. So a place like Barcelona, for example, is a really small city where you have very cramped space. At the point at which, but actually, sure, go ahead, O.
So given the fact that you have the ability as given by the info site to buy them, you're probably a high-class professional earner, i.e. finance, tech, both of you are working a pretty high earning job.
Sure, yeah, you're on like 150 a year. Let's go with that. In terms of why the surging demand here is so particularly pernicious, it's that there's very limited real estate for you to buy in the first place. So at the point at which an area is being gentrified, there's a massive amount of young professionals in these areas who are looking to buy. Which is to say, you tend to see these massive shops where the price goes up incredibly. But it's not just demand. There are three areas in particular which makes housing prices in Central European cities pernicious. The first is that these places tend to see a lot of speculative investment, which is to say the process of gentrification is a signifier that these places are about to go up in demand. What happens then is that property developers move into these markets at a ridiculous pace, so the actual price of housing at the point at which you buy probably exceeds what the actual asset price is. You're forced to pay a premium that is excessive compared to the actual value of the house. You're shelling out huge amounts of money. The second thing to note is that you also face much higher property taxes at the point at which you're buying, which is to say when you see more demand, there are assessments of value that property taxes are based on. So the council tax that you pay in Islington, for example, is like 3 times what you're going to pay in the Council of Wandsworth. The reason this is important then is you're not just talking about serving a mortgage that's incredibly expensive. It's the fact that you're paying a tax repeatedly, which is really expensive. And the last thing to note here is even if you are a young professional, it's that your credit rating's probably likely to be quite low. You may be freshly out of university, you've just married. There's the first major asset that you're likely to buy, is likely why you're likely to see a higher interest rate, particularly given that there's been shocks in the housing market after things like COVID. Sorry, last thing I'm going to suggest here is that you're also just often competing with things like Airbnbs, especially in large European cities like Barcelona, because these are important tourist centers. So you've got massive housing pressures, not just from people who want to live there, but are establishing Airbnbs, which is like you likely have to pay top dollar on your housing itself. But second, I think this also just looks like massive commercial prices, because the process of gentrification changes the high street itself at the point at which you buy in a place like Islington. And this is your classic, like the Gale effect argument. But the way that this actually works is at the point at which we have young professionals coming in, they tend to have higher commercial demands, so they want things like fancier coffee shops. And in turn, this drives up the prices of all the businesses around them. So your groceries actually get a lot more expensive. For you to be able to put more food on the table, you're shelling out a lot more than you would if you lived in the suburbs. But the second way that I think shops become massively more expensive is that you also see surging commercial rent in these areas, i.e. it's because the property taxes tend to go up so much that these businesses have to shell out a lot more to operate in these areas in the first place. The only way they're willing to bear with those prices is if they pass them on to the consumer, that you face massively increased costs when you buy in the city. We think on the comparative, the reason the suburbs tend to be a lot cheaper, or at the very least more stable, is because they aren't seeing this surging demand in the first place. So one, I just think there's less demand in these areas for things like real estate because there's less people who want to live in a place like Wimbledon. At the point at which that's true, you're likely able to buy for a lot cheaper, but you also have much more stable prices. So you don't see things like the speculatory pressure that drives up prices so incredibly. And at the same time, you're like the cost of groceries and other shops is actually cheaper. Why is this the most important claim in this debate? I think there are three reasons. One, at the point at which you're serving a mortgage that's incredibly expensive, you lose the ability to actually enjoy your disposable income, which is to say, if OO is right and you're a very high paid professional, this is the perfect age for you to enjoy it. So before the things of like burdens of children, you have a desire to to travel, and you have a desire to spend huge amounts of money on new areas, at the point which all your rent is, or all your money is going towards serving an incredibly expensive mortgage, you lose the ability to actually maximize that value. Two, you can just get a lot more space when you buy in the suburbs, i.e. the kind of house you're likely to buy in a place like Islington is a tiny little shit flat where you're cramped for space incredibly. On the comparative, then you get things like a spare bedroom, an office space, or a study where you're just able to enjoy your property a lot more. But the last thing to note over here is that most people are building wealth at this point, but they don't want to spend an incredible amount on mortgage because they're saving up for later huge expenses. So something like a car, for example, but uniquely the side that allows you to save a bunch of money because you're not spending an incredible amount on your mortgage. The second claim then on why your community is a lot better at the point at which you live in a suburb. And the first thing I want to do here is just wash out the push on things like lifestyle. Why is it that living in a city is actually bad, even if this is a massive urban center? First thing to note here is just what I said about public transport. If you need a night out in central London, you can get on the tube and go have your night out. But I think there are several reasons why this is still just not a great place to live. The first thing is that there tends to be a lack of separation between your home and office space, which is to say, you often see the same kinds of people in your everyday life, the point at which you live in highly commercialized cities. Because this is a young professional, it's someone who's now forced to go to the same clubs and pubs as their employer, for example. They lose the ability to separate out for themselves an identity linked to their home ownership, linked to their presence. Two, I just think cities are incredibly overwhelming. There are lots of social pressures, for example, to go out and to go to to have very active social lifestyles. At the point which you're getting married young is probably something you want to opt out of, specifically because you're trying to raise a family. But I also think it's just things like the isolation from your family. The point which these are people who tend to live in suburbs because people tend to move out of city centers as they age up. We think on the comparative, you're able to find community in two unique ways when you live in a suburb. The first is that you often pick a locale and neighborhood, and these locales tend to be a lot more communally interlinked in the first place, which is to say, in a world in which there's less to do because you don't have the same propensity of things like third spaces, you often invent communal spaces, which is to say, most suburbs have strong identities where there's a local football club everyone goes to. There's the local pub that everyone goes down to watch the World Cup. The reason we think this is important is you're able to build strong connections with your neighbors. You know the people who are near you, have a sense of routine in your everyday life. But two, I just think this looks like a lot more support, i.e. at the point at which you have strong relationships with the people around you, that's someone who can now babysit your kids when you go away on a weekend. It's someone who's willing to give you a hand if you fall into financial troubles. The last thing is that I just think childcare looks incredibly stronger. If you have better schools at the point at which there are less students in every individual school, you have the ability to get support from your family. You just have a much easier life. For as many reasons, go with OG.
I thank the PM for that speech, and I'd like to talk about Leader of the Opposition. Yeah.
Okay, can you see me and hear me? Two arguments in my speech. Firstly, about why lifestyle in the city center is just much better, and secondly, about why investment in an apartment should be a good investment and a bad investment, which is in the suburbs, will be detrimental to your wealth. Let's start with a few rebuttals. First rebuttal, you will probably be able to buy an apartment that is good enough for you in our world as well, and probably better, right? First thing, you don't need such a big apartment, right? This premise of, oh, I need an office space, I need a big suburbs house. I think this is very, USA centric. I don't think this is the same in Europe. But secondly, the city itself gives a lot of benefit. For me in Tel Aviv, I have lots of washer dryers that are very close to me, very, very cheap, and I don't need a washer dryer in my home. I have my office 15 minutes of walk from me, and so I don't need a home office, although I have, obviously, but I don't need it, and it's not required for me to live in the city. So I think that you are able to minimize your apartment in order to do that. But secondly, if we talk about taxes, you still buy an apartment in the center of your state or country, and so you will have the same taxes. This is a very weird argument. And thirdly, most of the time, cities want to have young urban couples, right? They are very good things to the city. So taxes would be lower for them in many cities in Western Europe because the cities want to attract them and not the Airbnb. So we think it won't be that more expensive. Not more expensive at all. And secondly, it is still easy to access the big city because of good public transport. I don't know. I've been to London multiple times. The public transport is shit in London. This is the same in many Western cities in Europe. hope there were no, structural analysis on why it is good, and I want to hear them. Okay, let's start with the first argument about lifestyle in the city center. So, why it is good to live in the city center are three main reasons. Firstly, population density, right? You have much more population. This means that you can have, firstly, more diverse services that will cater to different sectors of the population because you have simply more population. And secondly, you can have simply better volume of services. So you can have just more events, more schools, more clinics that are specifically for LGBT people because you have an LGBT population that is big enough. Secondly, you have more businesses and more mixed usages of the city centers. This is critical, right? Because business property taxes is much more money to the municipality than private property taxes. This is just a fact. And so the municipality is able to provide much more services to the citizens themselves because they have this additive money. But secondly, the population, the civil population needs to pay less comparatively to the businesses because there are more businesses. This means that you are able to have more capacity to receive services. But thirdly, the city center, many of the time the municipality have an interest to keep it clean, nice. This is what tourists see. This is the symbol of the city. This is what is the government offices are there. And so it just gets much more maintenance. But fourthly, and this is very important, because you have less parking, it means that the planning of the city is from the get-go less for cars and more for public transport, for bikes, for things that are generally better for the user of the city. And this means that you have less air pollution, better way to get into to arrive inside of the city center. If you have kids, it is less chance of them getting hit by a car, but rather driving by bike and stuff like that, like we see in Berlin, in Copenhagen, etc. Impacts. Firstly, you simply have less air pollution, less chance of car accidents, which are happening much more in the suburbs when you have to get to the city, when you have much more usage of private cars. Secondly, much more ability to raise your children, where you have more healthcare, more different kinds of healthcare, more education, etc., better public transportation. This is extremely important because this is what you care about. You want this good future for your children. But thirdly, it is much more likely that you will be able to find your own community. As a gifted child in the suburbs where I grew up, I had a really hard time until I moved to Haifa, right? And I had my friends there. I think this is the case if you are slightly not in the majority or not in the mainstream, but even in the mainstream, there are different types of people in the mainstream, right? You are much able to get this community, not in the suburbs, but rather in this big city. Before I continue, yes, OG?
I'm genuinely confused by this claim. It's probably true that there are more hospitals, but there are also less people in suburbs. So the question isn't like, can I go to every hospital in the world, but like, is the waiting list sufficiently small?
Firstly, I don't think it happens that way, right? It don't happen like that way in education, right? You are allocated to a certain school, you are allocated to a certain clinic, and I don't think you can, but still you can choose, right? So if I live in Tel Aviv, I can choose between different schools, I can choose between different parks, hospitals, etc. You can do that in the suburbs as well. Second argument, this is already winning the debate, right? Because you have more chances, this is what's important. But secondly, about why investment in our world is better. Firstly, why it is a debate-winning argument? Because buying an apartment is the biggest financial decision that a person gets. If they do it wrong, it affects their trajectory and their wealth for the rest of their lives. You've decided to buy, so you have certain wealth that you want to invest. Why in our side this money gets much more return on investment? Firstly, as the motion declares, there is gentrification, right? You buy it now, it means that the value goes up and will continue to go up to the future, right? Because it will be rise because more people want it, etc. Secondly, more people want the city center, right? It means that while the suburbs are declining in popularity, people are moving from them to the city centers. They have less jobs, they have less things that people want. You are guaranteed that for the apartment that you bought, you will always have people that want them, want to buy them, etc. And so it will continue to rise in price. But thirdly, because the population is generally stronger, it means that NIMBYism exists much more in the city centers because the population can defend itself, go to the city much more, to the municipality, complain much more, etc. It means that your apartment won't be surrounded by projects that you don't want, that are devaluating the value of your apartment, but rather it continues to be important and continue to have its value because no bad development is happening around it. Why it is extremely important. Firstly, mortgages is so expensive. You can be in a huge issue if you are not able to continue and pay your mortgage. If the asset that you have is declining in its value, it is a huge issue. Secondly, there is a lot of instability in life, right? Sometimes you want to move out of the city center because you're moving to a different country, because you got a new job. Sometimes you are a developer, but now the AI market is causing a trouble and you are losing your job. You want in these instances to be able to sell your apartment and to get the money right here, right now, and rent. You cannot do that in the suburbs where you are not guaranteed that your apartment will hold its value. You can do that in the city centers. We call you to oppose.
I thank the allo for that speech. I'd now like to ask about Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Can you hear me? Also, there is no particular reason why there was a massive Quebecois flag behind me, so just ignore it. Give me 1 second. I'm going to begin by responding to the stuff that we hear from OO. The kind of surface level responses that we get from to the material that was given by Prime Minister is first that you don't need space because, for example, there's a washer dryer across your street, or for example, you don't need your home office because you have a real office. I think even if I'm taking this claim at the most charitable, where yeah, you can get slightly more affordable housing in London if you sacrifice some amenities, the issue with this is the problem is when you are buying a house, when you are thinking about things like affordability, when you are first looking at the lump of money that's going out of your bank account and into your mortgage, for example, there are things that you think you don't need. For example, you think that you can live with lugging your laundry across the street twice every week in order to do this kind of thing. But there are different time states that consumer has, right? When you're paying this money in the beginning, obviously you're going to think that it's fine, but as it drags on in your daily life, you're going to become incredibly burdened by it, especially as your life develops. For example, especially if you're in a city, for example, because in a city, your life is incredibly diverse. There's lots of stuff going on. For example, you might choose to raise a child in the future, or even like a pet or something. Like at those stages, then the tasks that you originally thought were not that big of a deal become incredibly burdensome. I think at the end of the day, people look at houses because they choose where they want to live because of the amenities that are available to them. There, right? And as it adds up, it becomes a massive convenience if you're able to live somewhere, for example, in like a fairly large house with 2 stories, and you get to have a garden so you can have your own green space instead of cramming it out in some cramped park near your apartment and things like that. So I think this kind of thing isn't unimportant. It does add up. The second thing that I say is actually taxes are the same in suburbs, and also taxes are lower for young couples in the cities because they're not businesses. This is just empirically untrue. The ways in which things like council tax are absolved, for example, in London, is if you're a student, for example, it doesn't apply in the same way for a young professional because they know you're literally making money. So why would the state not have an incentive to tax you? It's also just not true that the taxes are same in the suburb because these kinds of council or property taxes are determined based on the value, and because of all the reasons we've already given you, and also because this is empirically true, your properties are often valued more highly in cities, so you do have to pay more taxes. Again, the kind of small costs that add up. And finally, on public transport, yeah, maybe public transport is bad within London, but there is a very well-developed train system that can take you to nearby suburbs. The Elizabeth line goes to Reading, where my parents live, so it's literally fine. In a lot of these developed Western cities, it is incredibly accessible compared to whatever alternative you might have. Also, if anything, it's symmetric, right? Because the tube in London is something that you would take anyway if you lived in the city center. So why would it, so for example, if you wanted to go into the city, if you lived in suburbs on just the outskirts of the city to like access, for example, if you want to go to a bar with your friends or something, you're going to have to take the same system anyway, and it's often pretty good. One additional thing on affordability, actually, the other thing that comes with gentrification is not just the prices of your property goes up, it's also that everything surrounding it goes up, right? So for example, your groceries are like empirically more expensive in the city center than they would be if you live in the suburbs. This is, again, one of those things that adds up to your daily cost of living. Things that you could be doing with that money instead, for example, like applying to a better school for your child, or even getting like daily luxuries to make yourself feel better about your life as you're slaving away at your tech job or whatever. These things are incredibly important to a couple that is just starting out on their lives and things like that to begin with. I want to then address the final thing that came out of OO, which is the stuff about investment, about how, if you're living in a gentrified area, that means the prices are high and the prices will go up. So in the future, you can sell your house for more money. The first thing I want to say to this is that this mechanism is incredibly perspective, right? And it's genuinely just not certain that that the prices of your house necessarily will go up, or that you yourself won't be priced out of your own area, because gentrification does not accrue in a certain manner. It doesn't accrue just in one area, especially in big cities like London or Paris or Barcelona. Oftentimes gentrification is happening simultaneously in many different areas at once, like a machine gun style of it, right? There's different areas going up at once in its price and its cultural value and its attraction and that kind of thing. The issue with that is then the companies that are entering don't have really a clear incentive mechanism that you as a young couple can trace to see which area is guaranteed to be the highest in price in the future, which is to say that there is also a pretty large chance that the area that you're choosing to live in now, 5 or 10 years down the line, it continues to boom and then suddenly gets gradually abandoned because it's no longer a profitable area for those companies to come into, which is to say that you are just not certain whether or not your home prices will actually go up, or if you yourself are priced out of your area. That's just shit for everyone involved. So the comparative is that home prices in the suburbs are oftentimes genuinely just much more stable. Just much more stable, and you're much more likely to be able to resell your home as an investment if that's what you're thinking of doing. The second thing to say then is just that a lot of people don't actually see their house as an investment, especially if you're a young married couple. You're probably looking at your house as somewhere that you can raise your family, somewhere where you can see your future occurring. So you're not necessarily looking at your house just as an asset. So this kind of thing isn't really even that important to everybody. I'll take a quick POI before I move on.
You would never need a car if you live in the city center. This is not just a trend in which you sometimes need, sometimes not. If you have more competition and more demand, it just means needing.
But like, is it that big of a deal to have a car? Like, why is that such a bad thing? If I have a car, I can drive around. I can like go up to the Peak District if I like, and like go see the lakes. Like, that's pretty cool. I like that. Okay, I want to talk about community quickly because I'm going to address that to the optionality stuff from OO as well. The thing about community, especially with gentrification, is that the primary impact of loss in affordability is you push out a lot of existing long-term residents. So, for example, there was a recent case of this ethnic market in London that's now going to be replaced by a Whole Foods or whatever. There's going to be very little existing community in the areas that you're moving in because it's a booming gentrified area. So there's a lot of new cycles of young people moving in and that kind of thing. Yeah, maybe those are the kind of people that are in the same situations in life as you are. But for all the reasons that I've given, there's a lot of instability in whether or not you can actually stay or if you want to stay in those areas. And for all the reasons that Ryan gave you. So the issue with that is that there's oftentimes there's a lack of stability in the community around you, and there's also a lack of existing communities. So people, for example, don't know where the best place to go is because everyone is a new transplant. People also don't tend to stay for a long time in city centers. There's a reason why the stereotype is a lot of people move to the suburbs when they start to get older. So they don't often stay in, for example, the middle of Soho or whatever for the whole periods of their lives. There becomes an incredible flux of community. So you then lose out on things on like having reliable neighbors to rely on if you need something, like someone to cat sit your cat or something like that. In that case, then things that O talks about, like optionality, doesn't actually matter, right? Because maybe you want to choose between some things, but oftentimes then the choice becomes incredibly overwhelming, and that impacts on your quality of life as well. And again, you don't need things like optionality for essentials, like schools and hospitals, because you're probably getting those things anyway, and you only need one hospital because like doctors are the same. Proud to propose.
I thank the DPM for that speech, and I'd like to welcome up Leader of the Opposition here.
Hello, am I audible? All right, let me just join with the camera because the mic of my computer sucks. Amazing. I am going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1, and let's first of all begin to talk about finances. Andrew, as OG themselves concede, you are likely right now at the upper cohort of your age bracket, right? You're likely very much professional in order to you to have the money to buy the home in the first place. Why does this matter? Because in the short term, even if you are paying more, you are still compared to the rest of the people that you are socializing with, probably very rich, right? Compared to the rest of your friends, studying, I don't know, art degrees or whatever, or are just making like significantly less money than you. Even if you are spending less, it is unclear why this impacts your quality of life or psychological quality of life so much. And this is a very short-term impact. What actually matters? A, there are very big structural changes in the workforce, especially for your professional jobs, right? Think about high tech, think about finance, either being replaced in large scales, and even if not, there are massive shifts where instead of just like working and doing code monkeying or whatever, you need to learn how to work with coding agents, you need to reinvent yourself, all of that. Why does that matter? A, because in the worst case scenario where you're literally replaced, you need an asset in order to be able to sell and maintain your lifestyle while you're shifting away. But B, even if you're not, you need the flexibility, right? If your company is downsizing and you need to move to a different company or a different city, you need the flexibility to have an asset that you can sell and not an asset that is going down in value comparatively. Second of all, just opportunities, right? The people who move the jobs the most, who move the cities the most, who act opportunities, make way more than people who stay in the same job in the same city in the same opportunity, because that's when they're competitive, they can negotiate for salary, etc. We give you the ability to sell the house, to move away in a far easier manner instead of being stuck with a mortgage. You sell for far more profit, you reinvest in this and that. So for the longer term, you stay and be the ability. Number 3, the later house. As OG themselves concede, the majority of people do move houses later on in life, right? OG say from the city to the suburbs, etc. But the majority of people in the first time home, they didn't make as much money as they can in the future. We give you the ability to sell the house later on for a far higher profit. And when you need to raise a family or when you want to retire, to buy you a much fancier home staying for the longer term. So both in terms of the worst case scenario, the highest impact scenario in this debate, and for the longest term, we give you an asset which can actually save you much more time as compared to the short term scenario where you're probably good anyways. What are OG responses to this? Number 1, you don't see it. The main response I'm going to respond to right now is you don't see like you selling the house and you're going to move on later. Number 1, OG themselves concede that most people like move on later. So I think that the most people see it. But number 2, I think that you having the option, even if you right now don't see it, is probably good. If you get offered a far better job, if you're being replaced, you need to sell. Even if right now you don't see it as such, it's a good option for you in the future. And this matters because actual debates aren't about what you like see it, about what's good for you. Note, I consider the majority of the OG analysis regarding why prices go high. I would just like to point to 2 obvious things. Number 1, it doesn't matter what the principle is if you're making more return on the investment, right? You're rich enough that you can make the principal, and at that point, making an investment which is more profitable for you, even if it's more expensive in the short term, is probably better. I.e., sure, you have a higher mortgage, but you can actually make way more money by it growing. 2, the OG analysis itself shows that the demand for city centers is growing, that demand for suburbs is declining as population declines, etc. So OG analysis, when you put it on a time scale, usually shows that you're making more money in the larger term. So as per previous one, this is good for you. The OG main response to it is, but you're paying groceries and all of that. 2 things here. Number 1, I don't think the groceries in the cities are necessarily more expensive, because note that there is far more scaling up of the businesses because they're in like a city and more localized place, and there's also more competition between businesses as compared to the one pub that can rip you off. But B, as per OG, you're going to go to the city center anyways because that's where your job is and that's where all of the nightlife is or whatever. So as per open government, you're still going to spend a lot of groceries in the city center, so this is mitigated out. Then Yael's simple analysis, right, in terms of just the fact that this is literally a gentrified community, in terms of the fact that NIMBYism is just way more easier to do in cities as compared to building new neighborhoods, which is far harder to regulate against. Compared to the fact that the demand for suburbs is dropping, as population is dropping down, as people are getting concentrated in cities, just means that your ROI from buying it in the home and being able to sell later is significantly larger on-site opposition. This is a winning thing. The last thing that opening government says is, you can't know if you're in a profitable neighborhood. A, this is just symmetric between both sides. You can't know if you're in a profitable suburb. But B, we have structural reasons, right? That city centers are more profitable, that the areas that are being gentrified, therefore literally increasing demand as given by the info slide, will have more demand in the future. Though you just say, what if it busts though? I don't know why it will bust compared to the fact that many people are moving in and will be able to engage in it. This is just a highly speculative, weird claim. And I think that structurally, we beat opening government by their own analysis and by our own analysis. Before we move on to like community lifestyle, whatever, CG.
Yeah, so read the info slide. It's in the process of gentrifying. None of your analysis works if you don't explain to me why the gentrification will be successful and the value of the house will actually remain.
So I think that just in terms of probability. A, we've shown to you that the house of the city outside will not remain. B, I think that if it is in the process of gentrifying, A, as per opening government, the people who usually make the decisions on gentrification are companies, the people who construct, the people who buy the house, the people who improve the neighborhood, the businesses who move in. I think that they have pretty strong both incentive for the housing prices to continue to rise and capacity to determine which neighborhoods are good and are not good, as in they don't want all of their house values to immediately plummet the houses that they're currently building and staying. I think that even if over the long term this is likely to plummet, A, the fact that you can sell, that you can move on, that you can increase it in the short term, but B, just the fact that people are already moving in means that the demand is probably structurally higher than when you have bought the house, as in right now it is in the process of being gentrified. In the future it will be a fully gentrified neighborhood, as in way more people will be in, many more people who want to integrate. Know that the minority of people want to move into the neighborhood before it's fully gentrified, right? Most people want the neighborhood with the services already being there. Most people don't want to take the risk in the initial term. So it's likely that when the neighborhood is more gentrified, more people want to move in than in the short term. But let's talk about community quickly. First, I want to flip the OG community argument on several metrics. A, note that as per OG, the people who live in suburbs are usually older because that's when people move outside in the city center to the suburbs, usually as per opening government. So I'm unsure why you can relate to these people, why you have the same things. Even if these people exist, I'm unsure that they're going to form a community with you. Age gaps are a real thing. You have different values or who want different experiences, etc. Number two, as per OG, you're likely to use the tube or whatever to go to the city center. This matters because that means that you don't actually have a local community or pub, right? You want the amenities in the city center that they are already analyzed to a better and don't get a response from OG. You want to meet with other young people as per your age. So community is not being built even if many young people are there. Number three, I think that the fact that you're not integrated with your co-workers is actually a bad thing. People work for most of their life. I think that you having a community with your co-workers that live in the city center and being able to meet with them and being able to go out after easier is actually good because the majority of time is spent with your co-workers. So having better community is better. On space, I don't get why you need it. Opening government never explains why you need space, really. Note that intimacy is good. That's when you do more interactions, and also cleaning is bad, right? And most people spend a lot of their life cleaning, and having less space to clean is actually a pretty good thing for quality of lifestyle. The last thing I would like to say is, oh, you can go by the tube to the better services. Being next to the services actually matters a lot in terms of how much you get to enjoy them, right? Think about like going to a night out drinking with a bar, having a good time and either needing to cut it early to catch the tube or just being on a hangover in the way back instead of just crashing out. Think of getting a hookup, right? And having to drag them to the suburb in order to actually do the sex instead of just doing that in the city center. Think about hosting your friends instead of being dragged to the city center. I know that is a mean impact, right? But in reality, you being closer to the services means you can enjoy them more, that you can immediately crash out, that you can socialize more in your own apartment, that you can host, or you don't have to spend a lot of time traveling and going through them, which just ruins the psychological experiences. Kind of mean impact, but in terms of psychological experiences, it's a real thing that being closer to a bar means that you can enjoy it significantly more, and this matters by itself. Opening opposition.
I thank Diallo for that speech, and I'd like to ask about the member of government here.
Hello, am I audible like this? Just a minute, let me set up my notes. All right. I want to outframe the opening debate at the start. Two reasons. First, there's one clash where OG says you're paying more for a house than a gentrified area, and O says that you're rich anyways. This clash does not matter because the budget really doesn't change on either side of the house. A more realistic vision of this debate is that there is a set of money in which the couple is willing to pay. If you spend less than that budget, fire, but it's not a huge benefit. If you spend a little more than the budget, it's also not a huge issue. So we just don't think the amount of money paid for this house is something that has mattered in this debate. Secondly, both teams in opening rely on assumptions about the preferences of the young couple. OG says you want space. O says you don't need a big house. OG says you want community. O says you get a younger network. OG says that it's nicer, it's quieter. O says that it's denser and it's more diverse. The point is, we don't know what a young couple want, and either is a reasonable guess, which is why we're going to resolve this by our extension proving why the gentrified area is much more volatile, much more unstable, which by itself is a universal harm because if you can't predict, then you can't make choices based on the specific set of preferences that you're able to have. Extension then on why the area going through the gentrification is far more volatile and uncertain, both in terms of the monetary value of the property and in terms of the lifestyle that you're able to afford. Four things. Firstly, on why you're far more susceptible to economic shock. The premise of this claim is that in suburbs, the housing price is more anchored to use value. This is because the demand is relatively constant in these values. How much an asset is worth is something that is tangible and measurable based on the house and the community around it that is basically unchanging for decades of years to come. Versus in a gentrified area, it is more based on the narrative value. It is based on how much investors believe the house would be worth in 5 or 10 years. This means that it is highly volatile based on things like narratives around the area, things like economic developments and general economic trends in the country, etc. Two implications of this. Firstly, when an external shock occurs, the gentrified areas are going to be affected the worst. So this looks like a recession, which is likely the AI bubble might burst. There's a lot of wars going on. Trump is doing shit with tariffs. Like the AI could restructure the workplace. The point is that when a recession occurs, people will delay purchases and demand will collapse inside these gentrified areas because people will not be willing to buy these new houses. There could be a crime that occurs in this new gentrified area and nobody will suddenly want to buy a property there ever again. The interest rate in the general country might rise because of monetary policies, which means that young people are less likely to want to buy a house in general and therefore less likely to enter the gentrified area. Compared to suburban houses, which is a defense against shocks, it's an investment that you put in and you know that even when there's an economic shock some year into the future, you still have a valuable and tangible asset that you can hang on to. It is comparatively a lot better. Secondly, the pool of buyers for gentrified areas is very homogenous. It is all young professionals looking for development inside the city. What this means is that number one, it is more vulnerable to economic shocks and downturns and interest value rises because young professionals have less job security and they have less saving. But secondly, at one point, oftentimes young couples will want to all move out of the small apartment. For instance, when everyone decides to have children, this is generally a similar age happening in similar years. This means that the price of these houses would inevitably go down if the project doesn't become super successful and attract more young couples to move in, which means that the fall of the house prices on their side of the house is structurally determined to happen if it is not something that is largely successful, which they have never proven in this debate. Second mechanism, we think that the project developers face both a problem in sort of incentive and a problem based on capacity when developing a new area. Three things. Firstly, in terms of incentive, Op says that you can choose an area of high potential and you will want to do so. But know that the residents inside these areas have an active incentive to avoid decreasing the house prices further by shaping the narratives around it. This is why they pretend the area is fine. This is why other residents living there wouldn't tell you problematic things about these houses, such as the water or the electricity system not working, because they don't want their own housing prices to fall. Developers also have plausible deniability for very specific failures. For instance, they can blame it on the council policy. They can blame it on the new schools not willing to move in. The one single project failing and not delivering does not affect the general reputability of the developer, so they do not have a good incentive. Secondly, project developers only need a short-term hype. This is mentioned in DPM, but it does not mechanize. This is because contracts are oftentimes signed over spans of 10 or 5 years, and people face high costs to move out of an area and move out of a house that they have already bought. This means that developers only need to persuade people that this area has potential and they can gain income from this initial payment that they get, and they do not need to ensure that anything is actually delivered at the end of the day. But lastly, in terms of capacity, there are structural reasons why it is difficult to choose a good area. For the couple, they often need to look at advertisement, look at the narratives around these areas, and it is extremely hard to compare which gentrified area best fits their preferences because every one of them is just trying to advertise, and you don't know what is going to happen in 5 or 10 years. There's a lack of control project developers have over choosing this area because you need a council approval to build a new bus line, for instance. A factory might just refuse to move out even when you initially agreed inside your negotiations. A schools or shops can refuse to move in, and these are all things that you just genuinely cannot control. Third mechanism, gentrification is structurally likely to fail. This is because of the high volume and density of actors inside this game. First, there could be opposition from existing residents. They can go up and protest, and in Western European countries, this is normally pretty effective. Secondly, there's a lot of legal barriers, such as council policies on what is likely and unlikely to be built, and you never have any control over that. Thirdly, you have no control over whether other developers would also move in and increase the housing and the infrastructure overall. And lastly, it is extremely hard to predict and plan because it is hard for you to know how many people actually move in at the end. But note this is really important because even if gentrification is successful at the end, it is going to take long years. It is going to be extremely slow. This happens in Western Europe. One little building takes 5 years to be built in Western Europe. And the point is, because it is slow, in the first 5 years you live there, nothing is going to be delivered, and you're going to live a shitty life where there's no school, where there's no shops, where infrastructure is extremely bad, and you're never going to get any of the benefits. Before I move on, I'll take a point from opening.
As per OG, most people start in the center of the city and move to suburbs as they age. This is a hype-based process based on the promise of a better life in the suburbs, which also gets cut due to economic shocks, killing wages, or false lies of marketing.
So that's exactly why it is all young people living in these cities, and when an economic shock happens, they're also the ones that are likely to be most vulnerably affected. On impacting then, two major things. First, there's a good chance that gentrification just does not happen well because of the lack of infrastructure and services, because asset values can fall, or asset values are likely to fall because there's huge uncertainty in what kind of services that you get. In terms of crisis, this could be a huge financial loss to the family. This is why the reason why this is important, because this is a young married couple. The first few years of their marriage is the most crucial determinant of how good their life is going to be. This is when your romantic relations are the most vulnerable because you haven't figured out how to live with each other yet. This is when your job security is also the most vulnerable. So in these first few years, it has also happened to be the least likely years for any benefits of gentrification to be fully delivered, which means that your life could be shitty, you can start hating on your partner, and your love life just genuinely collapse, and it's something that is irreversible on either side of the house. Lastly, just on the quick comparative of the suburb, we think that the trend is that there's likely going to be a rise in asset value, given that more people are choosing to work away from home. So a lot of young couples actually enjoy things like environmentally friendly lives, like they're able to afford this because of better transfer systems, etc. So the general trend we think is that your asset is likely to rise when you live in the suburbs, and for all these reasons, CG.
I thank the member of government for that speech. I'd now like to ask about opposition member.
Audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, I wanna clarify something, right? Like, if you're in an inner city area, if you're in a city area in general, right? I mean, like, whether gentrification succeeds or not, you still have baseline access to like certain services, right? You still have baseline access to just because you're close to them, to more businesses and more leisure services, more like dry cleaners, right? I feel like this is like because you're just in the city area, you can access them much more easily because you're just closer to them. But secondly, I feel like cities, even if they don't just successfully gentrify, still have maintained a baseline level of quality of life, meaning that it's not going to be a big deal if it doesn't gentrify or not. Maybe, and I'm going to prove and weigh why finances are not the most important thing in this round. Firstly, what do I prove in this speech? I'll prove to you why your relationship is better in the city over the suburbs, right? Firstly, my first main push is going to be that there's much less reproductive labor in dealing with apartments, and therefore you are much less stressed over arguments and conflicts over reproductive labor. And secondly, I'm just going to argue why you have access to better leisure facilities and more access to closer friends you've probably made in university, for example, meaning that you can like stress relief better. Firstly, the city has more services that are easier to access for reproductive labor, right? As in, if you don't want to cook for maybe if you don't want to maybe cook a dinner for like one day, right? You can go to a restaurant, for example, which is relatively affordable in cities because they have competition with other restaurants. Maybe you go to a McDonald's, for example. It doesn't need to be the healthiest thing. Maybe it just needs to get the meal done, right? And secondly, it's much closer, right? As in, I mean, firstly, government says public transport, and there's a few problems with this claim that it doesn't fully take down. Firstly, I mean, the problem with public transport, there's a safety issue with public transport, or at least a perceived safety issue, right? As in, especially in Western Europe with the recent immigration waves, people feel that crime is rising on public transport. They're much more uncomfortable using it. The quality of public transport is going down. It's a bit stinkier now. It's not as comfortable to be in these public transport facilities. But secondly, I feel like the city has more services that are easier to access on reproductive labor. You can access them easily by walking to them. Maybe a dry cleaner, for example, maybe a restaurant. You need to like do a specific laundry task that is too hard to do at home. You give it to a professional dry cleaner, right? So why is this important? This means that like reproductive tasks are easier because there are specialized services more on cities. So maybe you can hire a professional apartment cleaner, which is much cheaper than cleaning an entire house, for example. Secondly, smaller properties are actually good. I think briefly mentions this, but I'm going to prove to you why smaller properties are actively better. I feel like intuitively, like yard management is pretty hard. Mowing the grass is pretty hard, right? You need to do a lot of physical activity in order to do this. You need to go, and many of these have basements, for example, or second floors. You need to go up, down stairs, for example, to mop the entire floor of the entire house, for example. And there's like larger spaces to mop overall, meaning that you need to physically exert yourself much more, right? Why is this uniquely bad? I think many young couples are in status quo, or many young couples are dual income, meaning that both of them work. So I think these arguments for reproductive labor are much more like intensified when both are tired from work, when both are like don't actively want to do that. And I think either they neglect their living environment, meaning that their quality of life overall goes down, and this hurts their relationship, or either there's more conflict over the increased amount of reproductive labor needed, meaning that this just causes conflict and argument overall more. more, right? But secondly, I mean, like the uncertainty in uncertainty in owning a house is much bigger, right? As in, if you need sudden repairs, for example, if you're in an apartment, you can pool resources with other people who own shares in that apartment, right? To actually do some repairs to manage your property, right? I mean, there are many apartment councils that do this and share the burden of the big cost. However, if you own a house, the utility bills are purely on you. You need to maintain every part of the house with your utility, I mean, especially with rising gas prices, right? And because you need to heat up a bigger room, and it's just much more costly overall. But secondly, I want to emphasize that if something breaks down, you need to repair that on your own. You don't have any other renters to help you, like take down the snow on the roof, for example, right? You don't have anybody able to split the cost when a pipe bursts, for example. And this is uniquely more costly and much more uncertain and stressful because in a relationship, because it's suddenly something unexpected occurs. It's much more stressful. It's much more costly. And I feel like these small increases in reproductive labor conflicts are what actually triggers what ends in conflicts and ends in relationships, right? Because this means that people are overall much less happy happy because of the lower quality of life overall. But secondly, I think this means that they're more likely to enter small conflicts. And I feel like if you ask any divorce attorney, right, it's the buildup of small conflicts that actually lead to a separation, right? It's the buildup and the perception that the relationship started to not work anymore that actually lead to these breakups in relationships. At this point, I'll take a POI.
It's genuinely
Uh,
It's genuinely
opening.
unclear to me that people buy houses as investments. Very few people own a singular piece of property, let alone multiple pieces of property. But the only side that shows you that you have to spend massive amounts of money, we save you the most income. I don't understand the case.
Okay, I think CG is right to say that you probably have a set amount of money already set aside to buy a house, and you're just buying which house to buy, right? I don't think it's like you probably aren't like spending different amounts of money because there have to be different levels of fiat for each side of the debate, and you have like say spend the same amount of money, and like yeah. Okay then. On to the case on like why you have less stress relief. Because I've proven to you why your life is much more stressful if you own a house and if you're in a suburb, right? I'll prove to you why stress relief is harder to access, which compounds these impacts. Firstly, I think there are less leisure facilities overall. The fact that there are less restaurants you can go to that are novel, the fact that you can go to less escape rooms together means that you have less fond memories with each other or with people who are non-partners, right? As in, like, if you're in a city, you have access to more of your friends to take advice, to vent, to talk with them. And I think these are stress relieving activities are very important for relationships because, like, if you're always constantly with your partner and if you're in more and more likely to arguing with them, you're more and more going to be pissed at them. You're more and more going to be not very happy about them. Whereas if you have at least these stress relieving activities, you're more able to be happier about this and like relieve your stress, be able to have a better mentally healthy outlook. Okay, on to weighing, right? I'm gonna gut check this. I mean, the price is like they tell us groceries might be expensive. Firstly, I think inner city grocery stores compete with each other, meaning that maybe they're a bit more costly, but like it's much less of a monopoly, meaning that there's much more price competition among grocery stores. But secondly, I feel like what was I saying? I feel like like all the economic benefits. These are people who can afford a house already. Maybe they just buy worse quality groceries overall. I don't know why this is a big deal. Whereas we prove that why on our side these actively lead to conflicts that are actually stressful for the relationship, which is actively more important. Actively, like you can't substitute for other cheaper products.
I thank the member of opposition for that speech, and I'd like to talk about government work. Here.
Sorry, I'm just gonna wait for the siren to leave. Yeah, in a city. Okay. So I think Crystal has already explained why we're winning this debate pretty clearly, but I just want to go through the mechanisms that we actually get from opening government and explain why they're completely insufficient on the volatility claim and also just on the general economic claim about why prices in gentrified areas are probably just going to be pretty shit for you. What do we tell you? We tell you that our main claim is that houses in gentrified areas are significantly more susceptible to economic shocks. I'll be fair to opening government, they do have material on this, but the problem is it's just kind of bad. The first thing they say is that there's going to be speculative investment. The problem is they don't tell you why. They don't give you the reasons as to why investment in gentrified areas is going to be particularly speculative or why this ends up impacting you. Because it is reasonable that opening opposition says, like for example, that these people, they look and they try and invest in the best area and they're going to do a good job at investing and they're going to find the areas that are really good. So let me give you a couple of reasons as to why investment quality in these areas is actually going to be terrible rather than just giving you the headline. I actually have loads. Number one, you need the government to actually back you up by helping you have more transport links in the area. You can't just build more flats. Look at Battersea. I don't know, maybe Andrew knows Battersea. Like, they just built loads of flats and now you can't get anywhere because there's no tube lines, because it used to just be like 3 houses and now it's like thousands of people. So you have to literally wait in a queue to get on the tube every morning. Even if you do live in the city and your workplace should be 20 minutes away, it takes you an hour because you have to queue to get on the tube because the infrastructure doesn't back it up. Secondly, it's because of the fact that like often when you do gentrification in an area, notice this is in the process of being gentrified. It's not an already gentrified area. You are just literally taking a gamble on whether things like crime will go down, whether good schools will be built, whether people in the local area will actually move out, or whether they'll just keep protesting outside of your house every day because the area has been gentrified. Whether you'll actually get shops that you like and you won't just have, like, I don't know, for example, like the same local shops stay as they were before, which is maybe not what a young professional would like because of things like racism. They don't want like the cultural shop, they want like the Starbucks or something. Maybe you don't actually get those things in the end, meaning it's actually pretty miserable. You could also have loads of problems like the fact that Crystal said that loads of people will move in and out of these areas at the same time. So even if it seems like it's going to be a good investment, by the time that all the people who are also graduates at the same age as you also want to move out and move to somewhere different because they have a family and the flat they could afford only has like 1 bedroom in and like half a bathroom or something terrible because these houses are so expensive, you're going to try and sell the house and there's just going to be like no one to fucking sell it to because the hype of the gentrified area has moved on and now people don't want to live in Battersea, they want to live in Shoreditch or they want to go somewhere else. I mean, you can't sell your house when you're left with a useless asset. They try and give you some other reasons like property tax, but this is kind of stupid because property taxes are always going to be pretty low because councils want to compete with each other to win votes from the people, so they put council taxes as low as they possibly can. So it's just kind of weird to say that council taxes would be a lot higher in municipality lowers areas. They can't just assert it. Then they have a whole claim on enjoyability, which is just like really fucking strange because they say that you can have a community and they can like give you money when you're in financial problems, but I don't know, like, why? Like, if they want to run the community claim, they need to explain why I'm likely to be able to pick a good community when I go to the suburbs. We fit in this gap of analysis because we explain why it's uniquely difficult to pick a gentrified area that has a community and has people that you like, or will just be like a nice place to live in general, because the advertising budget on these things are so big, because property developers have leveraged so much debt to go into this area that they care so much about getting you to move in that they will just like shower in good press and make it seem like it's a good place to live when it isn't. At least on our side of the house, if you do care about community, we give you the mechanism that it's much easier to be able to like tell if an area is good when it's not many people living there and it's just like a little village or it's a suburb, because you can go there, you can talk to people in the area, you can just like see how it is, whereas I think it's probably quite hard to do that in a gentrified area because there are so many people living there. Why are some specific reasons though that this is going to be a good investment to live in a suburb? OO says in a POI to Crystal that these places are based on hype, and it's a hype that people want to go and move to the suburbs. Yeah, this may be true. There may be some element of hype, but there's also a lot of structural elements, or i.e. not like structural reasons, just like literal structural things of things that don't change. I.e. it's you live near a river and people like living near a river. I.e. you live near a park and people like living near a park. I.e. I don't know, like you have a like really big fucking house and people can rationalize why the house price is going to be so high rather than just like a tiny little studio that's only popular because it's like in the trendy part of town and the trend might move on. There's also structural reasons like the fact that there's people shifting onto remote work. There's also the fact that there's a significantly greater range of people who suburban areas can market to. I.e. if I'm like an old couple, I don't want to live in the trendy, loud part of town with all the clubs in that's been gentrified and is cool. I want to live somewhere quiet. Whereas, and in these quiet areas, you can have people, young people, you can have professionals who do remote work, you can have loads of different groups of people, meaning that there's just more people you can sell on your house to, should you want to sell on your house, meaning it's probably just structurally a much better investment. Let's talk a little bit about the opening opposition material though. Opening opposition opposition have a couple of kind of interesting claims, mainly on lifestyle, given I've already dealt with the other element. First thing I want to do is give you loads of reasons why transport is actually probably better going from the suburbs to get to any really relevant place to you in the city than getting from one random place into the city into a different part of the city. The first thing is that there's just significantly lower congestion. So if you do want to drive somewhere, you can. The second thing is transport corridors that get you from suburbs into cities are genuinely excellent. Like this, and there's loads of reasons for this. Number one, it's because rich people with voting power live there. It's because politicians live there and they want to do the commute. So they do just selfishly care about having good transport links. Number three is because lots of young professionals and also older professionals live there. So the like actual productivity of banks and like lots of parts of the city depends on being able to get people in and out of the city. Thirdly, there's just less people using the commuter line, meaning it's going to break down less because there's just like less weight on the railroads. Anyway, before I go on, hello.
Even in your best case, it's a short-term case as crises fade. But suburbs are harmed by crisis much more because there is less population and more.
But this isn't your case.
Usage.
But this isn't your case. You've just come up with this crisis point now. Even if you do want to buy this crisis point, what are these crises? What do they look like? Why is the suburb not impacted more? I can name a load of crises which suburbs are impacted much less by. Pandemics, because less people live there. Maybe like water shortages because less people live there. Maybe when there's a storm, like you can go in your community more because you live close to people and you can actually like go to be friends with people. I think it's just like a weird point on crisis. You need to actually prove it if you want to run it. The final strange point they have is these ideas about like it's going to be cheaper to live in the gentrified area because like they want to attract you and they want to get you to come in. There's one big reason why this isn't the case, and it's because the thing that they need the most in a gentrified area is companies, meaning they need to massively cut company taxes in the area to get coffee shops to come, because why else would the coffee shop fucking come to this new area that no one really lives in yet? This means to pay for the local services, they need to increase your individual tax on yourself. So I don't think this mechanism works as to why it would be cheaper. Quickly on closing government, I've left it till last, but I think it's because the points are kind of superficial. Most of it is derivative from opening. The new thing that they do bring is this idea about conflict, and they assert to you that conflict comes from chores. Conflict doesn't come from chores. 50% of people divorce because of financial reasons. So it all collapses into the financial analysis that we brought you about why it's going to be economically terrible to buy these houses. At the end of the day, you can go on a run. You don't need a gym. CG.
I thank the government work for that speech, and I'd like to talk about opposition work. Here.
Right. Take a POI verbally. Starts on my first word. Gonna first weigh out price and income related factors on the broad government bench, doing some responses to both opening government and closing government. Then I'm gonna recollapse and rebuild on Bogoon's claims on lifestyle and why they are the most important thing and the most significant degradation to your marriage, to your potential life as a young couple. Firstly, claims on income. Even if we can't completely symmetricize these, I think we can bring it close in a variety of ways. I think we can do it in a way that is a little bit more comparative than what opening opposition tells you, which is simply that there are incentives to capitulate to the income levels of people and that some market dynamics will sort of adjust for this. I have three better responses. Firstly, I think suburbs have rapidly appreciated in value in Western Europe specifically alongside gentrified city centers in parallel. Firstly, for the reasons they point out on public transit, presumably it's a lot easier, for example, white-collar workers to move out and then to commute back into the city, so they take the disposable income with them. But secondly, because of the broader demand post-pandemic for things like remote work, there's more demand for white-collar workers to kick out to the suburbs and bring their income into these areas. Secondly, I think there's persistently low incentives to construct more suburban housing, and the supply of suburban housing is consistently constricted in Western European countries. And this is mostly to do with broad top-level EU regulations. Two things on this. Firstly, the EU historically strongly protects things like peripheral farmland and makes it very difficult to encroach upon agricultural land that already exists. So there's oftentimes extremely strong land use restrictions that make it very difficult to actually expand suburbs outwards. But secondly, I think there's oftentimes strong requirements from the EU for things like environmental targets, things like energy efficiency requirements for houses that make the upfront construction costs of new units high. Thus, it's very difficult to actually build supply in bulk. Thus, it makes the actual build process of building these houses extremely expensive, slow, and difficult. But thirdly, I think there's just vast problems with energy in the EU, and this ties back to what Bogoon tells you about, for example, utility bills. The primary dimension by which apartments differ from houses, aside from, obviously size, is energy requirements. Couple things on that, because the reason for this is the scale of the expenditure grows with things like more rooms, more light switches, more space, especially in distant, non-agglomerated suburbs where the price of things like the transport of energy utilities to the house is factored in. Two reasons then why the energy cost is just a lot higher when you live in the suburbs. Firstly, Western Europe still relies heavily on things like liquefied natural gas. So as a result, they have to constantly import and pipeline these things in. But secondly, they also extensively tax energy in order to provide the funding for subsidies for alternative investments and things like renewable energy as a result. So I think this means you're going to pay a large amount of energy bill on a month-to-month basis. How does this weigh into the round? Let's weigh it in 6 ways against government bench. Firstly, very charitably, even if you buy nothing else, I just contest that price is the most important thing for you above what Bogun tells you about your marriage. Firstly, I think you probably project some level of income growth for yourself, especially as a young skilled professional. Presumably your income now doesn't represent your income later, and you'll sort of project that you're going to make more as time passes. But secondly, as conceded by opening government, you have incentives to put your family and children first. So you might be willing to shell out a little bit more money if it means assuring a better quality of life, assuring a more stable family unit. We think all of these things will kick in later when we rebuild. Secondly, I think this just generally then flips a lot of the claims on property values being less expensive because it explains to you that there's a potent and consistent lack of housing supply and new housing supply in comparison to apartments that are constantly being, as conceded by closing government, constantly rotated in and out of. Thirdly, I think this separately flips opening government on housing price stability. To be clear, opening government might be right that you don't buy a house with the single-minded primary incentive of like gaining an asset, but I would argue it's still your concern. You don't want to sit on it forever and you want to leverage it if you can. 2 ways in which the stability gets a lot worse. Firstly, this is a monumental life decision and takes a lot of time to shop and compare options. It is really bad if the housing supply is constantly constricted and the price of real estate assets can change within months and quickly heat up or cool down. It probably just makes it a lot more difficult to actually commit to the property you want. But secondly, at some point, you probably just want to move out of this property. So you can oftentimes be subject to an extremely negative double bind where you buy at the time of constriction and sell at a time of relatively less constriction. So you end up getting less on the sale and potentially even losing money. Comparatively, even if you still buy from OG that the cost of living is higher in city centers, at least you can actually make plans around your single biggest asset. At least you can actually plan for when you're actually going to get a financial windfall that allows you to then make subsequent decisions about where your life is going to go and make subsequent family and career planning decisions. And to be clear, this is a very different claim than the DLO line on selling assets. The price going down from opening up is different than the price being volatile from closing up. And as closing up very correctly flags, this new material on like price changing is less reliant on this gentrification actually running to completion. Fourthly, this also gives meaningful responses to the claims on vulnerability to economic shocks, mostly coming out of closing government. 3 things on this. Firstly, economic shocks tend to cut worse in suburbs because the broad extent of suburban housing is heavily financialized. So when there are large-scale changes in the housing market or in, interest rates, mortgage burdens tend to price a lot of people out. Secondly, presumably their claims on hype are largely symmetrical. The suburbs aren't like a monolithic entity. There's multiple suburbs, there's satellite towns, there's hot and cold neighborhoods, even within those suburbs entirely. So presumably people are still doing things like horizontal transfers within those suburbs. But thirdly, even if we buy to the info slide to the max and believe that you have the fiscal capacity to weather the storm, presumably the economic shocks in suburbs still make services quite bad in these areas. Presumably the lifestyle amenities like childcare that you bought a suburban house for shutter. Presumably if less municipal taxes being collected, it damages your capacity to maintain this infrastructure. But fifthly, on the cost of living for things like groceries, which is probably their best claim, firstly, for all the reasons conceded by opening government on why it is quite feasible for white-collar workers to live in suburbs, there's probably a vast amount of disposable income moving out. So things like, supermarkets will probably adjust to this. But secondly, because of the energy thing and the utility things we point out, your baseline costs are largely very high and locked in. So you're still probably paying a lot on either side. What is the claim that Bilgun gives you? I think it's much better explained and more pernicious than the claims on having laundromat access from OO, and is also going to beat these claims on finances and fiscal qualities from government bench. What does Bilgun tell you? Firstly, the stress of domestic responsibilities and labor becomes amplified strongly in large spacious houses versus apartments. With a condo you own, you are responsible for maybe some level of internal labor, like refurbishment in a small space, while outsourcing all utilities and expensive renovation work to the condo corp. But comparatively, you're responsible for everything with a house in a massive space. And I think maybe it sounds a little bit trivial on face to claim that negotiating around like HOA requirements is a large impact. But I think that for most married young couples who want to have children, want to jumpstart their careers, extensive maintenance is awful and it's draining and exhausting and is a pernicious drain on their lifestyle. But secondly, I think the perception of illiquidity is a lot stronger with houses compared to apartments. So this flips the claim from CG on not knowing what you want. Firstly, I think apartments tend to be built in standard, so comparatively housing value appraisal is a lot harder. It's a lot easier to get harder to get prospective buyers. But secondly, buyers tend to be pickier. They're willing to, for example, drop houses if it doesn't meet their dream place or doesn't meet the hype they've imagined for themselves in terms of moving into a new house. So you have the perception of a smaller pool of buyers. Apartments have a less segmented buyers market. So you start feeling vast anxiety if you're ever going to be able to sell this house, if you're ever able to get your money back. The weighing for this is that it degrades the quality of your marriage at a fast rate. Firstly, for the literal reason that you've attached your financial future to this now asset that you see is largely illiquid that might not ever get moved. But secondly, this severely restricts your autonomy to financially plan when you're constantly accounting for a stream of potential repairs and renovations. Because I think it's largely conceded that luxury and leisure spending is what creates the buffer in these relationships. It's what allows you to remove tension and socializes you to the idea of wanting more and wanting better. But there's immense pressure on op bench to now pour all that disposable money back into your house to sacrifice your weekend trip to fix your roof. Proud to oppose.